Project Binky in colour. Starring Nick Blackhurst. Also starring Richard Brunning. And Rex Hamilton as Abraham Lincoln.
Tonight's episode, Tanks for the Memories. Coming up in episode 13, Nick goes completely off script.
I mean, it was all bollocks anyway. Look, there's not even anything written on this piece of paper.
I'm still wearing a hat. And Ralph takes a nap on the Mini. At the end of the last episode, Nick said,
"You know what? I think we're going to have a look at the fuel tank first."
Which confused me somewhat, as we have a perfectly good one here.
Yeah, I don't think that's going to work. Some bellends put a strut tower in the way.
Ah yes, that was you, wasn't it?
I think it's fair to say we've kicked around just about every option there is when it comes to this fuel tank, and we keep coming back to the same big problem, and that is, well, it's me, again. See, I want to be able to use this car, and that means it needs some range, so ideally I'd like a 50-litre fuel tank, and because it's me, I'd also like to have a little bit of luggage space left over as well, and that's quite a lot to ask of a very small space. Probably worth pointing out at this point as well that none of the options are going to allow us to run with a spare wheel, so that's just something we're going to have to live with. So, brief history of the tank discussion. Standard mini fuel tank is right out. It's too small to start with. By the time I've cut enough out of it to get around there, it's way too small. Next option is twin tank. Would be very appropriate, would love it. However, twice the fabrication, twice the plumbing, twice the cost. I also don't think it's a bad idea to keep the fuel tanks away from these two back corners, knowing what mine and Richard's right foot are like. So we're there on a single big tank. Now we have tried to find a single big tank off the shelf that will do, and there isn't one. So again, we're going to end up making something. And I think it's going to fit on this raised bit of shelf here. So we know it's going to sit there. We know we've got just over 900mm between the inner strut towers, so 900mm on maximum width of tank. We know what the angle is between that bit of flat and the seat back, and we know that we've only got 250mm between this level and the bottom of the fuel filler hole. For everything we don't know, it's over to my colleague.
Okay, so welcome to another Bad Obsession Motorsport maths lesson. We need to work out how big the tank's going to be to accommodate the 50 litres of fuel we need to run. So we know we've got 900mm between the turrets, and we know it's going to be 250mm high. But how deep has it got to be? Well, that's the question, that's what we've got to work out.
The first bit is easy. The volume of the triangular prism front section of the tank is found by multiplying the height, the length and the depth together and halving it. That gives us 11¼ litres straight away. This part is trickier. We know the height and the length, but we don't know the depth. To solve this, we need some algebra. So we've got to solve for x. First, simplify to 90 times 25x equals 387. Alright, keep your hair on. The answer is 17.22 centimetres. But we're going to round it down to 170mm to give us 38250 cc. Add the two parts together and we have a total tank capacity of 49.5 litres.
We need 50mm expansion room in the top of the tank, so we've made the height 300mm. So these are the dimensions of the tank we need to make. So I feel an enormous template coming on.
Our normal white card is a bit flimsy for something this size, so we've broken out an old corrugated cardboard box to modify for this purpose. We're still sticking to the trusty old masking tape though, you can't whack it. After all that cutting and taping, you end up with this gargantuan thing. Having said that, we're both suckers for an enormous box.
That actually fits really well, but it's a bugger to get in and out. And at the moment, it's just a bare box. It doesn't have any of the things a fuel tank needs, like a fill and neck or a breather or a pump outlet. So I think the best thing to do is take it out and try again. We're going to lose 25mm off the height and 25mm off the length. Now this will lose us about 1.5 litres of capacity and half of our air gap, but, you know, needs must.
So there's your 1.5 litre capacity. And there's your new receptacle. Should slide in a bit easier now. Lovely.
Well, that goes in a whole lot easier, so I think that's the final dimensions of the tank sorted. But before we get too carried away doing anything else to it, we need to think about a mount to sit it on. The trouble is we can't really make one until we finish the tank. So for now at least, I've got a couple of bits of flat bar that are going to keep everything in the right place until we get there. Okay, now we can start thinking about all of the other things that the bare fuel tank needs. And I think we'll start with the filler neck.
Well, as good a place as any, I guess. A hacksaw, some wood and a cardboard tube will make the dummy filler neck, and with that done, the template is nearly finished.
The filler neck was just the beginning. We've also got this lot to consider. We have got a filler neck breather, so air can escape when you're putting fuel in it and stop clicking the pump out. We've got an in-tank fuel pump, which is the way everyone does it nowadays because it's much simpler and neater. Having said that, the Celica's got a very shallow tank on it, so while we can use the pump on an extension, the return and the fuel sender unit are pretty much useless to us. So, to get around that, we've got a separate sender unit and a separate fuel return. This bit here represents a vent and tip over valve, and then these little blue crosses mark the centre lines of some bosses I've got to weld in, so we've got something to cable tie the fuel lines to. And since it's quite a big tank, these red lines here represent some internal baffles we're going to put in to stop the fuel sloshing about quite so much. I'm pretty sure all this will work fine, but before I commit any further, I need to check that the fuel sender I've got will fit the space available.
We've jerry-rigged the sender unit up just to make sure it's somewhere there or thereabouts. And all that looks pretty good from here.
And one last thing is I've added an external sump cum swirl pot that kind of needs to go through the boot floor.
Brilliant. Yet another hole in a perfectly good panel just to make things that little bit more complicated than they already are. He just can't help himself, can he? It's an affliction. Still, the box fits pretty nicely and there's plenty of room under the floor.
And while I'm sure that lightweight laminated cardboard fuel tanks are indeed the future, we're not quite there yet. So we need to do that all over again, but with something more substantial. But what to choose? Well, we could go for steel. It's cheap, it's easily available, it's nice to work with, but I'm unsure about its long-term exposure to toluene. Now we could get around that by using stainless steel, but that's heavy and expensive, but it is shiny. So I suppose that brings us to the fairly obvious solution of aluminum. But instead, we're going to use aluminium, because that's what it's called.
Quite. Here's a shiny new piece of aluminium that's been cut to the right length, but it's 25mm longer than we expect to need to allow us a bit of room for error. We're working to this plan for all the measuring and marking out of swage lines, hole centres, boss locations, etc. And the task of transferring it all onto the alley is laborious, but vital. After all that, we can pilot then drill out to size all the holes needed for the tank's baffles, sender unit, the in-tank pump, return and the breather.
I think it's time for the bead roller.
The bead roller, like most of our equipment, has been touched by the hand of madness. Another wiper motor and another unnecessary modification.
It's not unnecessary, I don't have enough arms.
A few bits of flat bar act as a guide and stops, and now it's time to see if his infernal contraption works. Well, that wasn't the complete disaster it might have been. With the bead rolling complete, you can see the one destined to be in the bottom of the tank is rolled the opposite way. The next job is to create a large inward swage around the return and the vent holes. We didn't have a dimple die big enough for this job, so we made one. And it works something like this. Now we can drill these out to size for the relevant fittings. And the next job is to whack everything that's got to be fitted in and decide what we can weld from underneath. The captive nut rings for the sender and pump, along with the little alley bosses for the hose clips, can be tigged on this side. Time to switch to AC and turn the welder up to 11. Well, at least 5 anyway. That's the first bit of welding on the new tank. And while it's not pretty, it'll do.
Well, that's that bit sorted, but before we go any further, I've got to have a haircut. Excuse Excuse me a second. Whew, that's better. Right, where were we? Oh yeah, I think we're ready to bend this tank up.
Time to break out the bender. Or the sheet metal brake if you prefer.
You may have noticed we've replaced the big heavy duty bending blade with this much smaller one, and that's for a couple of reasons. The first will become very apparent when we start to bend it up. The second is that this little one's also got a nice radius lip on it, which should give us a bigger bending radius and therefore avoid tearing the alley. We've already done a couple of test bends so we can get our eye in with where our lines are. So, here we go. Bring the blade down a bit. Line it up exactly where we want it. Clamp it fully. Check it, obvs. And bend it. Probably didn't need that much. Unclamp it, drag it through and do it all over again.
He may sound blasé about it, but one false move and hours of work go in the bin. You only get one shot at bending alley like this.
And then the same again for the final time, only this time over 90 degrees, and we should end up with something that looks like it might become a fuel tank. So.
Thankfully, nothing went spectacularly wrong. So what we've ended up with is this, the makings of a fuel tank. We can just trim that overlap off exactly at the line. You can now see that the only convex bead at the bottom acts kind of like a sump channel. So now all we have to do is weld up this seam and add a couple of ends on. Simples.
I'm afraid it's just not that simple. There's loads that needs to happen before we get to that stage. I find it odd that everything in voiceover land seems to be so easy. Do you know what I find most baffling? It's these, and they need to go in next.
God, really?
Don't groan. I'm doing the best I can with what I've got.
I tell you, voiceover land isn't exactly a bed of roses either. It's all I can do to make you look competent. Anyway, on to the obligatory plug welds for the baffles. There's dozens of these and they're boring, so we'll move swiftly on to the linishing and the minor adjustment.
We'll worry about getting rid of those linish marks when the thing's finished. Right now what we need to worry about is getting this swirl pot stroke sump thing attached in the right place.
So we've made that hole in the boot floor a bit bigger for some clearance and spent way too much time trying to measure and mark this out correctly. But now it's done, a few holes and a grinder later, and the hole is cut out. The hole is smaller than the sump as it only needs to be big enough to pass through the filter sock on the fuel pump pickup. With the sump, swirl pot, fuel collector made, it just gets tacked on for now to make sure we can actually get the tank in the car. And yes, this shot took more than one take after twatting the bloody thing on the boot lid surround multiple times. We've added a drain plug, just in case we decide to drain all the fuel out for some reason. With the fit confirmed, the sump is then welded on fully.
The next task is to weld in this -6 fitting for the fuel return line. Trouble is, I don't want the fuel returning to the top of the tank, I want it returning to the bottom of the tank. So we're going to have to modify this first with this bit of pipe.
To make this drop tube, we take it out to 10mm after carefully setting it up on the drill, as that's the OD of the alley tube. Squaring the whole end up with the end mill allows us to go the full 6mm depth that we've got. After cutting the tube to length, it can get tigged onto the fitting, and then the fitting can be welded onto the tank. The end of the tube is also strapped to the bottom of the tank to prevent any waggling about.
While that drop tube will certainly stop all the aeration in the fuel on the return line, it's actually more about stopping it sounding like someone's constantly having a waz in the fuel tank. That does get annoying. Anyway, now that's done, we've got a boss to weld in for the vent, and we need to take a look at the breather. And then we can think about some ends, and we might actually get this tank finished.
After welding in the boss for the vent, and Nick's finally getting his head round alley welding with this new setup, it's time to move on to the breather. And a brand new contraption built specifically for the job of creating a barb on the end of the tube. It's obviously a bit too high here, so we've got to open out the hole of it so we can drop it down and then keep it in the correct orientation. Before welding it in, it's lined up with the red marks, as that's the line that the filler neck is taking that mates up with the original hole in the rear quarter panel. And this is Nick proving that the pro welders you see on YouTube are actually very good indeed, and that we both need a shed load more practice. So all this thing needs now to become a fuel tank is some ends, so after cutting out, a swift visit to the bead roller, and some more TIG practice, we've got one of them on.
This end piece of the tank is an exact mirror image of this end. Almost literally, in fact. But as it stands, we've got no way of getting fuel into the tank, so we need a filler neck. And that means another blooming hole. Last one, I promise.
This tank has more holes in it than a slice of Emmental. You know what goes well with cheese? A nice glass of funk. So there we have it, all done. We've got the fuel pump module and the level sender, we've got the vent tip over valve and the fuel return, and we've also got the fuel collector in the bottom. So that's the fuel tank finished. Excellent.
Well, it certainly looks like a fuel tank, I'll give you that, albeit one with some slightly uneven welding in places. But no, at the moment, this is what I would describe as a Schrodinger's tank.
Oh no, you've welded a cat in there.
No, I haven't. Let me explain. As it sits here, this aluminium box may or may not hold fuel. If it holds fuel, great, it's a fuel tank. If it leaks, it's a very large, very difficult to use colander. As it sits here at the moment, it's unproven as either, and therefore it must exist as both. You see?
Great, so to prove whether we've got a fuel tank or a large sieve, we're going to need to blow it up. No, with air, not C4. And to inflate the box, we've got to seal all the known orifices. Judicious use of sealing plates, cap heads, elastic bands, jubilee clips, custom-made bungs, and the addition of adapted tyre pressure gauge will verify whether the cat is alive or dead.
We're not trying to inflate the fuel tank here, we just need it to hold a few PSI for a little while so we know it won't leak fuel.
Looks like it's time for a brew.
That's a relief, because I can't tell you how many hours are in this. It's not the prettiest, but it'll do the job, so I need to get on with mounting it. Which I guess actually makes it a 3-pint tank.
We start with some 25 by 50 box and then split it down the middle. Then clamp them to the tank and weld the join up. You'll see what all these little plates are for in a bit.
They're going to get welded in something like here, but before we can do that, we need to sort out this big hole in the boot floor.
Yes we do. First up is the CAD template, obviously. And after cutting it out on the 1mm sheet, yet another bloody hole is cut in it so we can access the drain plug. This captive ring will locate the removable access plate for the drain plug. Now the box is welded in, linished back and primed, it's time to move on to permanently fixing the fuel tank mounts. Moving swiftly on from what's effectively just a shot of Nick's arse, these fellas are for the ends of the tank to sit on, and they fit in here like this. Before it's welded in though, we have to make sure it's totally level. Make the noise! So there's the tank mounts completed. We've added these two little angles to stop any sideways movement in high G-force situations, and the mounts have been finished and primed and covered in high density foam rubber for vibration resistance.
I'm guessing you're way ahead of us on how this is all supposed to work, so it should come as no surprise that next we need to make some straps.
Now we could have made this quick and easy by using a couple of ratchet straps, but oh no, that's just not complicated and challenging enough. So what we're going to do is drill and weld and bend and form and grind a couple of strips of steel to make a pair of the most elaborate straps this side of Kanye West's watch collection. We debated the method of tank attachment for a very long time over many cups of tea, and while this isn't the simplest way of achieving it, it's elegant and effective, if time consuming and complicated. But what I really want to know is, where's the black paint come from?
What we need next is a tidy looking way of attaching these to the car. If you're easily startled, I'd look away now.
Cheeky git. Contrary to popular belief, I do actually do loads of stuff in the workshop, you know, like sweep up, make tea, tidy up, film, direct, edit, argue and produce these delightful little bits to bolt the straps up. They work in conjunction with these two captive nut plates which slot into these pockets in the seat back, something like this. After adding some more foam rubber to the fuel tank, the whole thing can now get assembled. An 8mm bolt with a nylock would have done at the bottom fixing, but the circlip grooved pin is a neater solution. The top fixing pulls the whole assembly tight against the mounts and squeezes the foam rubber to avoid vibration. Voila! The tank is in!
If I've got my measurements correct, underneath here should be a hole in the boot floor, and sticking through it should just be the bung of the fuel tank drain. Now that's not a good idea, so we better build something to protect it.
Thankfully his measurements were correct, and there's the sump plug. To cover it, we just have to join these three bits together with the welder. There. That looks really good. Time to bolt this baby up and... Hold the phone! He's painted this piece black too! He must have had a job lot fall off the back of a lorry or something. Still, it's very pretty.
We've got one last job to do before we can call this install done, and that's to sort the filler neck. Now I want to keep an OEM appearance on the outside, so the easiest place to start is with an OEM neck. Still bloody full of fuel. We'll have that after for the...
Stop right there! Moving on, this is the only bit we need off the old tank, and the plan is to remove it very carefully and very safely.
Joking.
No, even we wouldn't do something that stupid. After a little cleanup, it fits nicely over the swelled end of this 2-inch exhaust tube. Now shortened, and the other end bead rolled. And now with the breather tube attached, and finally the support bracket welded on. That fits to this little bracket on the strut tower. There, sorted. That's it then. Done!
So why bother going to all the effort of strapping this tank in instead of just welding some alley tabs to it and bolting it to the floor? Well, I'll tell you. This particular tank, with the pump and the sender and a couple of bits on it, is 10 kilos. Add to that the 50 litres of fuel it'll carry, another 38 kilos, that's 48 kilos. 105, 106 pounds if you're trying to work it out in America. And that is getting close to the weight of the gearbox in this car. Add to that the fact it's all sloshing around, and you can see how very quickly any aluminium tabs welded to the thin aluminium tank will stress fracture and crack. Bad news. So, very small tanks, welded tabs are fine. Anything bigger, spreading the load with straps is where it's at. Right, one last small job to do, and we can call this tank done.
Ah yeah, of course, the filler cap. A brand new OEM cap will do the trick nicely. That's not a brand new OEM filler cap, is it, Nick?
Yeah, I know it's not the stock look I was talking about, but I was on eBay and it was so shiny I had to have it. Anyway, it's all got to come out now because it's time to have a look at this parcel shelf.
About bloody time too. Let's get cracking.
I suppose we should probably start with the speaker rolls, keep him happy. Now, the plan was to create a metal pocket in there and try and drop the speaker down inside it. Now, due to the fuel tank, the amount we can do that is negligible and therefore it's not worth bothering with. So now I think we'll just keep it simple, plate over the whole lot, no one's going to see it anyway, and then we'll worry about the speakers when we get to that stage.
Even though no one's going to see it, we're still taking the time to trim and tidy these awful excuse for speaker holes before using a 2-dimensional CAD template to make the closing plates. Now that the speaker holes are filled in, the 2 small holes in the centre of the parcel shelf shall get the same treatment.
Well, that takes care of the holes in the parcel shelf, but to have a proper firewall, we need to do something about this.
Ironically, to fit these plates to seal the firewall, we've got to drill more holes in the parcel shelf. There. That will do. When it's seam sealed, painted, sound deadened and carpeted, no one will ever know what a state it was.
Whilst we're working at the back here, I rescued these C-post stiffeners out of a slightly later car that have been totaled. I don't think we really need them, but we've got them, and a bit of extra stiffness never hurt anyone.
Before these stiffeners go in, the window latch bracket has to go, so the grinder is deployed once again. There wasn't much prep needed for the stiffeners, as Nick had already drilled out the spot welds when removing them from the crashed Mini. So with those in, it's a little stiffer up the rear end. One more thing, reinforcing the seatbelt anchors. There, that's sorted and a lot stronger than the original mounts.
I think that's all the major structural chassis work underneath done now, so perhaps we should go back up top and revisit the scuttle panel.
Ah, the scuttle panel. This was left pending making sure the new bulkhead missed the wiper wheel boxes, because we didn't have a complete set to try. Well, now we do. And yes, they do fit. Just. Now it's just a case of plug welding it on for good. Then a careful linish back and boom! The scuttle panel is finished. I suppose we better just check the flip front fits nicely. Yeah, that's not bad at all. Excellent.
I think sorting that scuttle panel marks the point where all of the major chassis work is done, barring any alterations we might need to do later on. It also marks the point where I run out of things to do that isn't sorting the wheel and wheel arch situation out. So I suppose we better have a look at that next.
Right, so let's bolt all the wheels back on and drop it down onto our show stands. This marks the first time the Mini has actually sat on her wheels for more than 3 years.
A lot of people seem to think that these tyres stick out way too far and are going to be a bit of a problem. Whereas anyone watching who knows Minis is going to tell you these tyres stick out way too far and are going to be a bit of a problem. So what can we do about it? Well, we're going to start by making the wheels wider, obviously. Now, stay with me. What we've got here at the moment is a 175 section tyre on a 5-inch wide rim. And it's not quite wide enough for the tyre, so it's causing the sidewall here to bulge out a bit. The plan is to make the wheel wider by 2 inches, making it 7J, but we're going to band it inwards. I'd like to go to 8J, but I can't because we run into some upright clearance issues. Now what that should do is move the centre line of the wheel over an inch and therefore pull this shoulder in the same inch. It's not a lot, but it's a start.
So, banding a set of 5-inch rims then. This should be fun.
Now my little Myford lathe is nowhere near big enough to attempt to do this, so I've been forced to create a machine off the back of it. Now these are proof of concept wheels only, and the machine itself is lethal. So for the love of whoever you regard as holy, please don't try this at home.
The ancient Greeks wrote in legend of a terrible container in which all the evils of the world were trapped. How prophetic they were. All they got wrong was the name. They called it Pandora's box, when of course they meant Nick's imagination. For sheer destructive force, think that if he put his mind to it, Nick would give Oppenheimer a run for his money. The bit to the left of the wheel is effectively the drive flange, and this needs clamping up to the wheel nice and tightly. Then it's just a case of taking your life into your hands, firing it up and retiring to a safe distance. Like Spain perhaps. When the device has finished its work, you end up with a wheel in 2 pieces, into which will be going this piece of 2mm thick CR4 steel, guillotined at 52mm wide. It's 52mm to take into account the 1mm cutting tool to give us the 2-inch extension. After trimming it to length, the steel band is welded between the 2 halves of the wheel. And after some finishing off and painting, the wheel looks like this once we're done. You can see the extra 2-inch width when comparing it with the 5-inch version. So let's bolt them back on, replete with some new Yokohamas and see how it looks.
Well, by my reckoning that worked a treat, and we've now got a stick out of around 125mm, which is well within the coverage of a set of Mini Melia wheel arches, for example.
Brilliant! Something that's off the shelf, easy to get hold of and relatively inexpensive. Good news!
Yeah.
We're not using Mini Melia arches, are we?
Ah,
crap. Be sure to tune in next time for another exciting episode from the files of Project Binky.